Guys, it's Kate. I hope you're all doing well and you're safe at home. I know I miss being at school and seeing everybody and going to class every day, but I look forward to seeing everybody in the fall. So I really enjoyed this class. I think one of the main reasons was because it pushed me to pick up different stories and read things that I probably wouldn't have been inclined to on my own. And it also forced me to watch documentaries, in the same vein. And I think the documentaries were one of my favorite parts of this class because they were so interesting and rich with context for each unit. I felt like watching the documentaries was a way that we got to like put our feet on the ground and like really see what was going on. So I loved that aspect of the class, um, and it made me think about a class I took last semester on film theory, and we did a unit on documentaries and that genre and like what purpose do documentaries serve, to inform or to entertain. And a lot of documentaries that you see now kind of blur that line, but I felt like within the context of these units and the Middle East that they predominantly served to inform us and to give us like the best context possible to what was going on. So I like really enjoyed that part of the class, and like it got me thinking. Um, my favorite unit was Israel Palestine, because I didn't really know a lot about the conflict and the history of the conflict prior to this class. Obviously, I knew like there were serious issues and like the fight for control, but I didn't really know like the origin of that, and I think that that was really something that we covered well. Um, their independence and the 6 Day War, and like the back and forth for control of the land. Um, and then going in depth helped me to understand like more about the tensions there and why there are still ongoing issues today. Um, and then my favorite um, nonfiction that we read was Asma Al Ghul's A Rebel in Gaza, and I loved her book. I loved it so much that I used it for my research paper. And her story was just so personal, and she didn't sugarcoat anything. She was very honest, and her life has been very difficult, but I think her story was so important and it needed to be told. My research paper focused on media narratives and their impact on the female voice. And I used A Rebel in Gaza with the article on bad Palestinian mothers from Bad Girls of the Arab World. And I found that a lot of what we read, there was this consistent theme of like media control or control of information within the state by these governments or like these different groups of people. And that this was a major issue because the native people, like, they didn't feel like they could trust their governments, and so that's why they were that's one of the reasons why they were demanding change. And then in my research paper, I referenced Victoria Bigg's piece, Women, Faith, and the Politics of Space in Israel Palestine. And I liked her article because she talked about faith like in the context of the bigger issue, the whole conflict, but then she also like used this idea of politics of space, which I hadn't really heard before, and I think it's really interesting, and it's so applicable to what's going on there, and I think you can really see that in the documentaries we watched, The Settlers and Five Reckoned Cameras, because it really is all about like space and who gets to control it based on their religion and their race and their gender and their class, and it's just like it was so applicable, I think, to the whole unit. And then I also really liked the unit on Egypt, where we read the Yacubian building, and this story was really interesting because we were able to track all of these characters and their lifestyles and their beliefs, and we saw like the clash, the culture clash there, and we talked about how the book was a great like example of what life was like in Egypt pre-Arab Spring, and then like building up to the Arab Spring, and then the square like covered that, and like post, so the environment and the context like after that, and that was documented really well in the square, and it was just really interesting because we had like the firsthand footage of what was going on. The documentary actually reminded me of one of my favorite TV shows. It's called The Newsroom by Aaron Sorkin. And in season 1, they send one of the correspondents, Elliot Hirsch. She was played by David Harbour from Stranger Things. And in it, he goes to Egypt in 2011 when like tensions are building and things are happening. And he's there at the square, and he leaves his hotel room to go out and to get more like footage and interviews and stuff, and he is beaten because he is a journalist. But in the show, they have footage like from the square, like we saw in the documentary. So that was really cool because I like felt like I knew a little something about it before we started watching it, like watching the documentary. But the show, the newsroom itself, like touches on this idea, like I mentioned earlier, of like control of the media and these narratives and like who's controlling it. In the context of this show, it's like the machine like behind it, like who owns the networks and who dictates the stories. But I think what we've seen throughout the course is that the media over there is dictated by like government and church and state and that kind of thing. But I just think that that's really fascinating because it's the root of a lot of problems. And I think my biggest takeaway from the class and like reading these stories is to be more intentional about learning new things and like looking into hand accounts and checking different sources, because it's like really important not to have tunnel vision. I think a lot of times that I know personally, and maybe like other people my age, we like to look at things that are going on in the United States or like in Georgia or just us in Milledgeville, and it's really easy to limit yourself, and it's important not to try, like, not to do that, to look at different things so you can appreciate other things, and yeah, so that your perception is not distorted for what's going on in the rest of the world. So I think this class has been really influential in looking at or educating me in looking at other areas and appreciating other stories and different types of literature and documentaries and everything. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the content. And I'm glad that I took the class. So thank you guys. I hope y'all have a great summer.